Good afternoon. Today's session is titled Writing the Past. It got a little late, but I really wanted to suggest that they title it Writing Fiction, Writing the Past. One of the things that I want to talk to you about today is how does fiction help to write the past? What does it mean to write a fictional past, but which is based on a real past? So questions about different kinds of past. Before that, I just want to talk a little bit about Amitabha. Amitabha is an author, a novelist. He's also a professor at IIT Delhi. And this novel, Half the Night is Gone, is a wonderful novel, shortlisted for the 2018 Hindu and JCB Book Prize, and also for the DSC Literary Book Prize, right? So so the novel's prestige speaks for itself. So I thought that it would be interesting for us to structure this discussion around the characters, the plot, the structure of this wonderful novel. Some of the stuff that I think we'll be talking about will be spoilers. So I just wanted to give you a spoiler alert. But enough spoiler to get you interested to read this wonderful book, right? So the book is about 3 generations of South Asians, especially men from a business family, and their entwined lives with the servants that have served this family over the generations. Right? So it's a generational saga, and it's a book about a writer who is venturing into the lives of these men from different generations, right? So in some sense, it's a lineage. It's a novel that draws lineage and talks about what lineage means. So Amitabha, I just wanted to start by talking about, in several occasions you've said that what you didn't want to write was a historical novel, but you wanted to write about the past. What does it mean to write about the past, but not talk about history, right? What is the difference between past and history that you want to highlight?
Right. Thanks. Firstly, very quickly, I want to thank the Nepal Literary Festival for hosting me, the DSC Prize people for bringing me here, and Ajapa for agreeing to do this session and be in discussion with me. Regarding the notion of a historical novel, I think there is a certain idea of the historical novel which is current in Indian English or South Asian English writing over the last 30, 40 years. And that is a kind of novel which seeks to rewrite history or do history writing using the tools of fiction. The idea that history is a kind of story that can be told, which is very different from the disciplinary idea of history that historians study, where history is, the writing of history is a knowledge production of a certain kind, and a lot of it can be very dry, or economic history, or the history of business, etc. But which is, despite being dry, is not less important. In fact, sometimes much more important. For me, setting the novel in the past I've never written what one would call a novel set in the past before. And even in this case, when I set out to set the novel in another time, I didn't want to do that thing where I'm retelling history or telling my version of history through using the tools of fiction. My goal was more to set a novel in a different time, but still deal with what a novelist always deals with, which is how people feel, how they relate to each other, what happens in their lives, how they look for succor, for how they deal with difficult times. And in some sense, I went back to this period in the 1940s in India, not with an idea of, again, a lot of people who said books in that time are trying to kind of give their version of what happened, the traumas of independence and partition that India went through in that time. But that was not my goal. My goal was something a little more personal. It was to revisit and recreate a time in which, say, my father was younger, a generation older than me was born. So I think the historical novel seeks to recreate, the historical novel seeks to elucidate the past. I was looking to recreate the past, but recreate the past in the sense from the inside, if at all that makes any sense. Recreate the past in terms of the sensations that were experienced by those people who lived then. That was kind of my goal. So I think it was slightly different from that of the other
Right.
historical fiction writers.
I just, there's one instance in another interview where you said that you draw on the past because you see the past as creating a set of possibilities within which actors and characters and people function. So that's something that I thought was wonderful. And most of your characters in the novel are grappling with emotions, grappling with a sense of understanding of who they are and where they come from. So, I mean, I would want to hear about the father-son relationships that you've set up in the novel, and why do most of the sons in the novels keep going back to their fathers?
Right. So I'll give you a brief outline of how this book works. Basically, there's there's a Hindi novelist called Vishwanath. The year is 2008, and he's undergone a tragedy. He's lost his son, and this is somehow he's about 70 at this time, and this somehow makes him rethink his entire writing career. He spent his writing career writing these Hindi novels which have been sharply satirical, attacking the establishment, the corruption of the post-independence Indian state, and so on. And these angry kind of novels that he's been writing, and he's revisiting this. And he also starts writing a different kind of novel, which goes back to the place where he came from, which is Old Delhi, where his father was a cook for a merchant family, a rich merchant family. And he starts writing this other kind of novel. I mean, we think maybe he starts writing this other kind of novel where he starts telling the story of this family and its relationships with the servants who worked in that family. So it can be thought of that he's creating an alternate autobiography for his own past, although it's clearly not an autobiography because he's a novelist. So I think novelists don't write autobiography as such. What novelists do is they take bits and pieces out of the real world and then they start working with them, massaging them, and start spinning them around in space and looking at them from different angles. And that is roughly what Vishwanath starts doing. And that's basically the kind of the setup of this book. So that is general. The specific question that Ajapa asked was related to sons and fathers. Now, really, in 2019, I feel almost sort of a little sheepish in talking about fiction which is so sort of centered on men. But that was kind of my starting point. That is kind of what I know. And the relation, so look, there are two ways of answering the question. So the question she asked, I'm struggling with it. The question she asked was, why do these people keep going back to their fathers? Why is it about sons and fathers? The short answer to that is that was somehow very important to me at a particular point in my life. The father-son relationship and what that means and what happens when there's a big rupture, which typically happens with loss. And what happens is that you start reevaluating, you start rethinking, and the meanings of those relationships which are hidden start coming up. They erupt in these sort of emotional ways which are very hard to manage. So what the novelist does is that what can the novelist do? The novelist does what the novelist can do, which is tell stories. So that is one kind of answer. The other kind of answer to that question would be that uh, there is this kind of notion of inheritance that in South Asia is very important. Maybe in other parts of the world it's also important, but in South Asia it's extremely important. We sort of feel that, I mean, have you seen this? Like, you must have seen this. If you have a child, right? Someone will say, "Oh, this part of him looks like his mother. That part of him looks like his father." Or if he does, if he blows his nose in a particular way, say, "Oh, his father also blows his nose in that way," or whatever, right? Whatever thing. Everyone is always trying to link it up. This is a minor thing in some sense, but it shows how we think. Everything has a genealogy. Everything comes through the family tree or through some notion of genealogy. Even when people talk about their old college or their old school or whatever, they remake it in this genealogical way. That, oh, it's because I am from here that I am like this. So it's like there's a over determinism of genealogy. So maybe that's what also draws you towards that kind of theme.
While your book is about fathers and sons, I also do think that it's about women characters that really pop up, right? Your publisher, Juggernaut Books, did a good job of, when they came out with the book, they put out the blurb about one of the characters and how she basically attacks her father-in-law who molests her, right? And that was very powerful, and I think that was a conscious choice on Chiki Sarkar's part to show how this novel also brings in women characters. But there's one instance in the book that I really thought was amazing, which is when Omvati, who is the wife of a servant, Prasadi, she takes her son to a classroom, and the master takes a slate, writes his name, and gives it to him, and then he is presented to the class. And she also insists that the master write her name, right? And the master is a little surprised, but her insistence and her kind of insertion into that space of learning, I think that was very powerful. So you do have these women characters that in some ways, forge very important dialogues with these fathers and sons.
Well, look, what can I say? I can say thank you for saying that. Uh, but I'll tell you an interesting story about that, about the excerpt you mentioned. So there's a part where, as she mentioned, this character, she is being basically sexually harassed by her father-in-law, and she kind of gets back at him and puts that situation to an end. And my publisher, uh, she and my editor, both of whom are women, they took this excerpt and they put it in some magazine. And that excerpt appeared, and I was like, okay, good, they are promoting my book, they put an excerpt. But I thought maybe this was not the strongest part of the book. I was like, okay, this is a nice part, but it's not so strong. Then, a day later, my mother-in-law happened to visit. And she said something similar to what you said. She said, oh, that was chilling and was really strong. I really, felt it. And then I realized that I wrote it myself, but still my sensibility doesn't get to the point to understand what that kind of situation means for a woman. So, let me not take too much credit for that kind of thing, right? But yeah, I mean, in the sense, see, gender is very important in these kind of settings. This book is about gender. All my writing has been gendered. But the point where I come in on gender is that I feel that the male experience is a very gendered experience. And I think that the lie is to pretend that the male experience is the normative human experience. In my writing, that has never been the case. In my writing, I have not presented men as normative, as human beings, that this is the human, and the example of human is male. For me, men are men, and their maleness and their masculinity is a trap with which they also struggle. And so, in that sense, I have always written about gender in that sense, but it's not quite seen in the same way because typically when you say, okay, this is about gender, we think about women characters and what the travails they undergo.
Speaking of masculinity, one of the themes that runs through your book is about men and their emotions, right? And one of the things that I feel this book shows is the way that men have historically struggled to come to terms with all kinds of feelings: anger, love, loss of love, um, loss in, in the sense of bereavement. So I think all of your characters are trying to come to terms with emotions. And for that, they do this kind of self-reflection, which takes them to their past. But it also takes them, I think, to the cultural resources of their times, right? And my favorite character in the book is Diwan Chand, who is the younger son of Lala Moti Chand, whose the generations of his families are being traced in this book. And he is basically somebody who collects, he's aspiring to be a kathavachak of the Ramcharitmanas, and he's collecting the texts, and he's deeply interested in different interpretations of the text. And it is through that that he finds some reconciliation with his own emotional turmoil and his own emotional problems. So I want you to talk a little bit about Moti Chand and the Ramcharitmanas, and why did you choose the Ramcharitmanas as a way for him to come to terms with all of these things?
So I'll tell you I'll tell you a little incident that happened with me once about 15, 20 years ago when I was studying in the US, and then I was a postdoc there. I had a friend, he was Pakistani origin, but had grown up in the UK and the US all his life. And I used to have a CD of the ghazal singer Ahmad Jahanzeb, Pakistani artist, and he was singing this, and I was playing it, and this guy was there, and he said to me that it's strange how in this the emotions are all on the surface. He couldn't get his mind around the fact that a man could be singing and his emotional life could be visible right on the surface, because in the West that doesn't happen that much. So but the thing is that if you go and read, the bhakti poets, whether it's Tulsi Das, or you read people like Jaydev, who write about Krishna frolicking with the gopis and so on, right? Or you read Ramcharitmanas or Valmiki's Ramayan, so many other sources, Jayasi's Padmavat, where people are getting upset, getting angry, they're losing, they're grieving. Specifically the scene from Ramayana, which this book circles around, is the point where Lakshman is prone on the battlefield and it's not clear whether he's going to live or die, and Hanuman has gone to get the Sanjeevani to revive him, and Ram is having that kind of anxiety. He doesn't know whether this Hanuman's mission is going to succeed or not. So he's suspended between hope and despair. And the nice thing is how his mind is flitting from thing to thing. Like he's worrying, what am I going to tell his mother? She had given him to me. Then he's like, my brother, you never left my side. How could you do this to me? You see all the different tropes that could come up in such a moment are there. So what happens, my understanding, what happens is that often when we are in similar situations, we turn to these expositions of our grief. And by interacting with those expositions, we somehow purge or deal with or, frame our own, what we are feeling. So specifically, in South Asia and in many different ways, the women sing songs of grief, of lament, when the new bride is going away, etc. All these singing is there. But for men, there's not that much as there is for women. So, but still, the emotional life is still there. So in that sense, I felt, basically it was my intuition that these texts do this, and I was trying to discover a way, tell a story in which this interaction could be seen.
So, I just want to continue this conversation. Why Ramcharitmanas? What does it allow you to do? And what's your relationship with the text?
So, look, I had no relationship with the text maybe 6-7 years ago. And the story of how I came to it is something like this. I was sitting in my office one day, and I just realized I was humming this thing, Mangal Bhavan, Mangal Hari, and I didn't think much of it because sometimes things go around in your music goes around in your head, you don't whatever. But 2-3 days when it continued, I was like, why am I humming this continuously? So I thought it was Tulsi Das, but I was not familiar. So I googled it, and it turned out it was. So then I thought that I had been thinking of this setting a little bit, and I realized that at some subconscious level, I'd been thinking that this setting of this old Delhi, these merchants, should be linked up with this particular, with this thing, which something like the this Mangal Bhavan, Mangal Hari is something you hear on loudspeakers in Delhi. There's also a version of it from a movie, 1973 movie, Geet Gata Chal, with Sachin and various others, which is a famous version. So then what I did was I borrowed Ramcharitmanas from someone, and I borrowed it and I kept it below my coffee table, where it stayed for many months. I didn't pick it up, but I kept looking, I kept seeing it, and I kept thinking that I have to make this connection. So eventually, I did pick it up, and I did start going through it, and I found that, of course, the different episodes of the story are something I knew. I didn't need to read that book to, I think in South Asia, pretty much we all know that story. So I knew the episodes. What I was looking for in that particular text was the language in which Tulsidas presents those episodes, the poetry with which he presents those episodes. So that's how that sort of came about.
And I feel like a lot of the characters in the book keep humming it or keep reciting it, keep returning to it to give them a sense of solace, a sense of peace. But Vishwanath, it seems, the writer who is writing about these merchant families, he is of a different kind of disposition. He's a secular liberal writer, and he seems to be mostly quoting Sufi poets or Urdu poets, and but he's then writing this text about the Ramcharitmanas, right? So I think there's also this sense of secular liberal India's contestation with a text like the Ramcharitmanas and coming to terms with the fact that it has multiple meanings, right? I don't know.
You're asking these kind of questions which require these very long answers. I don't want to bore people, but yes, this is actually, you have observed a good point which I had not fully observed myself. That when Vishwanath himself writes, typically he does quote Urdu, and but in the text there's a lot of quoting of the Ramcharitmanas. I think for a particular class of a particular generation of Hindi writers, Hindi intellectuals, refinement was conveyed through a relationship with Urdu, whereas there's also intimacy that comes with something like Awadhi. But that's at one level. There's subterranean currents which link all these. And the thing is that, see, we are in a difficult time right now in India specifically, where the issues over, sectarian issues between Hindus and Muslims, Hindi and Urdu, etc., are all sort of roiling. And in the past, over the last 30-40 years, there's been this cultural argument made that our culture is the same and so on and so forth, and we share the same culture. Somehow I feel that argument has not necessarily worked, because that argument is not complete. I feel that the relationships are of a different nature, and that's why I worry about this relationship between Jayasi's Awadhi and Tulsidas's Awadhi. And this relationship is something that is actually talked about by Ramchandra Shukla, who was one of the early scholars of historians of Hindi and scholars of Hindi. And he talks about how Jayasi's Awadhi is very Thet. Thet meaning it's like linked to the land. You can, it's what people speak. Whereas Tulsi's Awadhi takes that basis and adds the Sanskrit vocabulary to it, because Tulsi himself was a Brahmin. He had read the text, so he knew the Sanskrit as well. So he created this kind of new language, was amalgam of Awadhi and Sanskrit. But if you look at Tulsi and look at Jayasi, you know that Tulsi has read Jayasi because he's younger, he's a generation below Jayasi, he's read him. And there are formulations which are straight out of Jayasi in Tulsidas. So the relationships are like that. You know, you can't imagine Tulsidas and Jayasi breaking bread. That would not have happened, may not have. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a historian. It may not have happened. But language is a site in which they do break bread. Right? So, so for Vishwanath also, you know, the different linguistic things, the different poetry he has read, it's all there. At the end of the book, he comes around to something from Jaidev, which is Sanskrit, right? And once the poet Bashir Badr said कि हिंदी और उर्दू दोनों संस्कृत के आंसुओं से पैदा हुए थे. I think maybe a little facetious, but you see this notion of the past and history and genealogy is all there.
And I feel like as someone writing in English, your immense love for the Hindi language and its history and its literature is reflected in this book. So how do you think about that? What is this a tribute to the Hindi language and its literature?
Well, see, I don't know. Look, anything anyone writes comes from a tradition, right? Literary fiction, in fact, I would say almost by definition, is that which is written in a tradition. When you are, like you're South Asian, you have 1 or 2 or 3 languages, and you know there are all these questions of you're deracinated because you think in English and so on and so forth. Then this is a problem and there's an opportunity. The problem is, what is your tradition? The opportunity is you can decide what your tradition is. So none of this was, I didn't think all this through. At some point in my life, some 20 years ago, I started reading Hindi, and some people introduced me to Urdu poetry. And when I started, then I couldn't come out of it. It resonated with me. It drew me in. It made sense of my inner world. It made sense of the world around me in a different way. It was something that I just wanted to be in it. You know, sometimes like if you get into a hot tub when it's cold outside, then you just get the sense that I just want to be here. I don't want to come out. I had that same sense with Hindi. I was just like, wow, I'm so comfortable here, right? And so I stayed there. It would be difficult sometimes to pick up something in English and read it. I mean, maybe I have this thing like, you know, for 2-3 years I was only reading Bashir Badr. I would pick up something else, and then I would, you know, put it down and pick up Bashir Badr. It's like, you know, sometimes you go to a favorite restaurant and you always order the same thing because it's your comfort. So that's what happened to me. So now, if you want to use the word tribute, I won't stop you, but it's not exactly that. This is just, I mean, look, I started feeling that this is just my tradition, and so I'm writing in that tradition. I even one book earlier, I had written this book called The Householder, which had a lot to do with the Hindi novelist Srilal Shukla. I had some issues, I have some bones to pick with him, so I picked those at novel length. And that's how traditions develop, right? I mean, you take something from the past, you know, have some conversation. So I decided to do that. Unfortunately, sometimes when you do these kind of random things that, okay, this is my tradition, I want to do this, it's not fully recognized or people don't understand it, because when I wrote The Householder, there were a lot of reviews, they were all very good and I was very happy for them. But the 2 words Srilal and Shukla were not mentioned in a single one of them. They were, despite the fact that I dropped those 2 words in every interview I gave, but no one picked them up, right? Our English reviewers were not aware. Whereas anyone who has read Srilal Shukla would have picked this up and say, okay, you are riffing on Srilal Shukla, got it, take and put it away.
You can say the same about this book, because Vishwanath is also, at a lot of levels, he is embodying some of the same things as Srilal Shukla.
The trajectory of his writing career is kind of a riff on Srilal Shukla's thing. So I think that discussion that I started there moves forward in this book and continues in a certain way.
There's another interesting thing that's happening that happens in this book, I think, is that it doesn't just dwell on the past, but there's also some indication about the future and what that would look like for these characters. And one of the interesting things that happens is after Vishwanath loses his son and he's trying to make sense of it and he's trying to come to terms with it, he thinks about the code that his son Shushant has come up with, right? He's a coder and he's come up with a code. Yeah. And he says that, every time somebody runs a particular system, that code runs as well. And that's, even though he's lost his son, that's a continuation of his legacy.
Right.
So how much of the future are these characters thinking about? And that's one of the things.
So, see, Vishwanath is 70, right? And he's just lost his son. And he's questioning the professional decisions he's made as a novelist all his life. So, but he feels that there is still space to make amends. There's still time to do something different, to get over the emotional and spiritual rut that he had gotten himself into and get out of that rut. At least that's what I think he is, because also, as a novelist, I think probably to get back to what I was saying about Srilal Shukla, I think I sometimes feel that the lack of hope is a kind of a moral failing. And in fact, there's something, I can't remember off the top of my head, there's something in Qurratul Ain Haidar's Aaq Ka Darya where she makes the same point, where she says, mentions that in the Quran, suicide is haram. So it's like being hopeless is haram. It's somehow a moral failing. And so Vishwanath is looking to find a way out of this. He's looking to what comes after. And, with that, because we always do have to hope for something else, no? That's why.
There's, Vishwanath, going back to Vishwanath and his kind of emotional registers, and hope is one of them. But there's also a sense of anger, which I think is very distinctive about him. There's one part in the novel where you talk about how he is being awarded either the Sahitya Academy or the Padma Shri, but the Prime Minister at that time, who meets him at the function where he's receiving this great award. So Vishwanath is also a bureaucratic officer.
He's a clerical
officer. So she basically says, the Prime Minister says that I haven't read your
Right.
I have read your files.
Right.
So, yeah.
See, the interesting thing is, with the difference between Indian writing, say in English and in the other languages, has been that there's been English writers came from an elite class, right, because they were English educated. And so as time moved on, that elitism remained, because in India, I'm sure it's true here in Nepal as well, English is associated with a kind of elite class. But Hindi, on the other hand, although it has had its elites, small elites, but the literary practitioners of Hindi did not belong to that ruling class. I mean, they typically, worked in sort of in a subordinate kind of role. And although their achievements were second to none, are second to none, and that is true in other languages also in terms of pure literary value. But because in South Asia in general, it's true that writing doesn't pay anyone's bills. It doesn't pay bills for the English walas, so it doesn't pay bills for the Hindi walas. So as a result, your life is not about who you are as a novelist or whatever, right? It's about your job, your day-to-day, whatever. And in that day-to-day, someone like Vishwanath, although he's a giant of letters, was still just a clerical guy moving files from table to table. And that is something that that eats at him. But it also, the nice thing about Hindi literature, on reading it you'll find, is the fact that these people's real lives, or you get the sense that the fact that these people's real lives were so real, that makes this literature so real. A great example of that is the novelist Vinod Kumar Shukla. You know, you get, it's like life seen from down there, in there. He's part of the milieu that he writes. And that is, I mean, in some sense, I envy people who have that access. So, yeah.
So, I said this before, but I think it's worth bringing it up again, is the question of, again, what you're saying, the Hindi speakers and the English speakers, and there's a gap between those two worlds. And in some ways, what this novel does is to say that the emotional world is pretty much, is maybe similar between those two worlds.
I wouldn't say similar. Similar may be too strong a statement. I wouldn't even say that these two worlds can be bridged or should be bridged. Certainly, I wouldn't say should be, because should is not what, I mean, fiction writers shouldn't be dealing with should, right? But I guess all I'm saying is that in my own life experience, I experienced some resonance, right? I experienced some, some connection. And you know how it is, right? With when we write fiction, literary, whatever, it's like we put our finger on some experiential sense, texture within us, and then we extrapolate it out, right? So somehow this relationship between English and Hindi that you're talking about, I just extrapolated it from some experience that I myself had, right? I'm not going to try and prove it. I'm not going to try and prove that this is true. And I'm certainly not saying anyone should do anything. I'm just saying that I experienced this, and so it is my truth, right? The writer's truth, which is not necessarily true in the other sense.
Which is the nature of your characters as well, right? Each of them are coming to terms with their own.
So, you know, I'll tell you, sorry, I just wanted to say one thing here. So, when I was writing this book, I had this idea, okay, the Ramcharitmanas and the setting and all that. And I was stuck, and then I came up with this idea that Vishwanath is a Hindi novelist who, and I can hide behind him to tell this story, which is more Indian a story than, you know, an English speaker can maybe claim to tell. And so fine, I had this great idea, but then I was stuck again, because I needed to know what Vishwanath's prose would be like. Would it be Hindi inflected prose? What would it be? What would it feel like? So I was struggling with this, and I went to meet a friend of mine, the writer Mukul Kesavan. And the Mukul Kesavan, in case you've read his writings and all, he has this tremendous, his quality is that he is himself. He's never anyone but himself. And we were talking, and I was telling him, like, look, Mukul, this is the problem, and I'm trying to figure out what this guy will sound like. And I don't think he even said it, but just sitting there talking to him, I realized that that prose would sound like me. It would not sound like me, not in the way I speak, but it would be my prose. I would be myself, and I would write that prose myself. So now here was the point of risk. Because I'm fundamentally an English speaker. I love the English language. I think in the English language, right? I live and breathe it. I enjoy it. Right, and so I decided I'm not going to Hindify this in any way. I'm going to write my own prose, and that is the prose of someone who has written already 3 novels in English and has a long-standing relationship with the English language. And as we say in Delhi, और फिर देखी जाएगी, होगा जो होगा देखी जाएगी. And I decided to do that. And the poor fellow who had to deal with the problems generated by this was my Hindi translator. He was struggling. He struggled sentence by sentence. And some reviewers said, oh, this sounds like it's translated from Hindi into English. Like, certainly not. Ask my translator. Because if it had been, it would have been easy to translate it back.
So for readers who haven't had the chance to read this book, one of the things that was fascinating for me is towards the end of the book, there are notes and Amitabha refers to all the texts that he uses throughout the book and gives us references to that. As somebody trained in the historical discipline where everything is about strict citational practices, that was beautiful. So it's also, I feel like you're giving us this trove of beautiful literature that's, again, referencing to so many different kind of literatures as a way to kind of push us to explore that, read that, embody that.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Look, I mean, in this book, one strong feeling that carried the process of writing this book and became stronger as I got to the end was a sense of gratitude towards the writers I have read. A sensation of a feeling of, of gratitude, of recognition, a bit like what a child feels for a parent. Sometimes you don't even articulate it, but there's a current that flows from those people to you. And it's like, by putting those notes at the end, my purpose was just to tell the reader that, look, this stuff is great. Please read them. And here you can see this. Look, here's a link. Follow this. Type this link into your phone, and you can read the same sher, the same ghazal. This is where it is. I want people to go and read those things because they meant a lot to me, and so I just want to share them with my readers. That's why. Otherwise, if you don't put the notes and all, people may not follow it up or whatever. Here they have no excuse.
So yeah, in literary criticism, there's a great word for it. It's called intertextual text, and this is just about like there's a book, and then there's a book within a book, and then there's a book with like books within books and books. So it's like terribly wonderfully layered in that sense.
Yeah,
right?
Honestly, I didn't mean to make it so complicated. It just worked out. I don't normally do that, but it followed its own logic and became like that. And I hope it doesn't cause confusion amongst my readers.
And it's the same with the way that the temporal structure of this book works, which is back and forth and back and forth. But that's done in a way that, that links people with across time, between generations and between emotions. So that's also something that the book does really well, is to move across temporal and
Right.
temporal space.
Right. It's a banner of storytelling. When I went to college at IIT Delhi in the 90s, and we didn't have internet and all at that time, so we entertained each other by telling stories about other people, gossiping basically. And a good gossip always, a good gossip, when they're telling a story about someone you don't know, always builds a character, right? And sometimes building that character, you have to go front and back in time. That, at this point, this one was there. 10 years later, he was going to do something else, but right now he's here. So then, so I've always found that mode of storytelling to be, it structures, it gives a richer texture, I feel.
Yeah. And I think there's some sense of the oral in this a lot. I mean, in the sense that Vishwanath, every time he's speaking as himself, not as an author, he's speaking to somebody he's writing a letter to, right? So in that sense, he's in dialogue with people at a more personal level, and it's in a manner of speaking. So even the oral is inscribed very well in the textual.
The orality, I think, in for example, the mushaira is the Urdu sher. As I say that ghazal is not written, ghazal kahi jati hai, you are saying a ghazal. So the Urdu poetry is all about recitation. The meters are tailored for that. There's a process. And even the manas, the doha and chopai form, they are made for recitation meters. It's all recitation. But apart from this, there's one guru of mine who doesn't come from the South Asian tradition, so this is the opportunity to mention him, is Proust, who he runs rings with his sentences. And there's a oral nature to that. Because how sometimes when people speak, they if you had to transcribe it, it would have to be comma, and then he said this, then comma, and then he came back, and then goes to an end. Proust does that. And in the process, when you talk, you can pull in different things into one thought and present that thought from many angles. Proust does that all the time. So that's a kind of Proust, to my mind, is a written oral kind of thing. He's the bridge between the oral and the written, to my mind. He taught me some of those things, I think.
Explain some of the sentence structures. I mean, it
Yeah,
explains the,
some of them are rather long.
Pretty
I,
cool.
I had I mean, my editor and publisher sat me down about that, and a lot of the sentences are much shorter than they were in the first draft, I assure you. I managed to win out on a few.
Wonderful. So I think we're going to start with the question and answer session. And if any of you want to speak in Nepali, नेपालीमा प्रश्न सोध्न चाहनुहुन्छ भने म उहाँलाई अनुवाद गरेर पनि प्रश्न बुझाइदिन सक्छु. But we can take a few questions. Floor is open. There we have one question.
So I really enjoyed the session. I'm Shivani, and I wanted to understand about your idea of nostalgia, because yesterday in one of the sessions somebody spoke about nostalgia. So I really like the feeling. I really like feeling nostalgic myself. So how
Right.
do you describe nostalgia, and does it reflect in your writing?
It does. I think I am prone to nostalgia, but I think those people who are prone to nostalgia must be very aware that have to be aware that nostalgia can also be sickness, because it prevents you from living in the present. And in fact, nostalgia in the 19th century, I think it was one of the conditions that were diagnosed for soldiers and all, that this person has a problem with nostalgia, send them home for a few days or whatever, right? So Vishwanath, in this book, nostalgia is there, and it is also explicitly rejected, because it's like something very sweet is good, but not in large doses. You know what I'm saying? I feel that too much of nostalgia is a moral failing, and I feel that because I'm prone to it.
Any more questions?
Here, there's one here, right in front.
Sorry, this may seem like a very obvious question, but we'd still like you to talk about it. You're a computer scientist.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
And some computer scientists work with bits and bytes and
Right.
Things called data.
Right.
And here you were talked about, your other life,
Yes.
which is of literary creation,
Sure.
going back in the past, memory, emotion, etc. How do you reconcile these two? Where was the meeting ground? You don't have too many data scientists writing novels.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, regarding this particular point, earlier I used to think that, okay, having two jobs is too much. I should have only one, and I would keep thinking about, should I choose this one or that one. But actually, it never struck me to ask why both of them are there. So it just kind of. Some people have often asked me that, how does a computer scientist become a novelist? And I typically ask them that, why don't you ask me how a novelist became a computer scientist? Answers, I don't know. As a teenager, I loved maths and I loved all that stuff. I loved literature also, and somehow never, I never had to make a choice between one or the other. So I just kept stringing both along, and here I am, still stringing both along.
More questions? No? Should we call it an end then?
Yes, let's call
Thank
it.
you
Thanks
so
a lot.
much for listening to this session and for your wonderful questions. This is really wonderful. Thank you, Amitabha, for being
Thanks
here.
a lot,
Thank you.
Ajapa. I appreciate it.